Chapter 17 of The Dragon and the Raven by G.A. Henty. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mike Harris. The Dragon and the Raven by G.A. Henty. Chapter 17, A Long Chase. The following morning the weather was still and dull. Not a breath of wind ruffled the surface of the river. "This is unfortunate," Edmund said to his companion. "Sweyn's galleys will row faster than we can go with oars alone, and though they may not know the Dragon, they will be sure that she is not one of their own ships. We must hope that they may attack us." The day passed on without a sight of the galleys, but late in the afternoon they were seen in the distance. The Dragon was moored near the middle of the river. Her oars were stowed away, and the crews ordered to keep below the bulwarks, and hoping that the Danes, seeing but few men about, and taking her for an easy prize, might attack her. When they approached within half a mile, the Danish galleys suddenly ceased rowing. "What is that strange looking vessel?" Sweyn asked the Northmen standing round him. "I know her," one of them said, "for I have twice seen her before, to my cost. The first time she chased us hotly at the mouth of the Thames, destroying several of the vessels with which we were sailing in convoy. The next time was in the battle where King Alfred defeated us last year, nearly in the same water. She is a Saxon ship, wondrous fast and well handled. She did more damage in the battle than any four of her consorts." "Were it not that I have other game in view," Sweyn said, "we would have fight her, for we are 2 to 1 and strongly manned, and the Saxon can scarcely carry more men than one of our galleys. But she is not likely to be worth the lives she'd cost us to capture her. Therefore we will e'en let her alone, which will be easy enough. For see that bank of sea fog rolling up the river. Another 10 minutes and we shall not see across the deck. Give orders to the other galley to lay in oars till the fog comes, then to make for the left bank of the river and to drift with the tide close inshore. Let none speak a word, and silence be kept until they hear my horn. I will follow the right bank till we reach the mouth." Freda was standing near and heard these orders with a sinking heart. She had no doubt that Edmund was on board the Saxon ship, and she had looked forward with confidence to be delivered from her captor. But now it seemed that owing to the evil change of the weather the hope was to be frustrated. Edmund and the Saxons had viewed with consternation the approach of the sea fog. The instant it enveloped the ships the oars were got out, and they rowed in the direction of the Danish vessels, which they hoped would drop anchor when the fog reached them. Not a word was spoken on board the Dragon. Edmund, Egbert, and Siegbert stood on the forecastle, intently listening for any sound which would betray the position of the Danes, but not a sound was to be heard. They had, they calculated, already reached the spot where the Danes should have been anchored, when from the left, but far away astern, a loud call in a woman's voice was heard. "That must be Freda!" Edmund exclaimed. "Turn the ship! They've passed us in the fog." The Dragon's head was turned, and she rowed rapidly in the direction of the voice. No further sound was heard. Presently there was a sudden shock which threw everyone onto the deck. The Dragon had run high on the low muddy bank of the river. The tide was falling, and although for a few minutes the crew tried desperately to push her off, they soon found that their efforts were in vain, and it was not until the tide again rose high 9 hours later that the Dragon floated. Until morning broke nothing could be done, and even when it did so matters were not mended, for the fog was still dense. The disappointment of Edmund and Siegbert at the escape of the Danes was extreme. Their plans had been so well laid that when it was found that the Dragon had arrived in time no doubts were entertained of the success of the enterprise, and to be foiled just when Freda seemed within reach was a terrible disappointment. "My only consolation is," Edmund said as he paced the deck impatiently side by side with Egbert, "that this fog which delays us will also hinder the Danes." "That may or may not be so," Egbert answered. "It is evident that some on board the Danish ships must have recognized us, and that they were anxious to escape rather than fight. They draw so little water that they would not be afraid of the sandbanks off the mouth of the river, seeing that even if they strike them they can jump out, lighten the boats, and push them off. And once well out at sea it is probable that they may get clearer weather, for Siegbert tells me that the fog often lies thick at the mouths of these rivers when it is clear enough in the open sea." When the tide again began to run out, Edmund determined at all risks to proceed to sea. The moorings were cast off from the shore, and the Dragon suffered to drift down. Men with poles took their stations in her bows and sounded continually. while at her stern 2 anchors were prepared in readiness to drop at a moment's notice. Several times the water shoaled so much that Edmund was on the point of giving orders to drop the anchors, but each time it deepened again. So they continued drifting until they calculated that the tide must be nearly on the turn, and they then dropped anchor. It was much lighter now than it had been in the river, but it was still so misty that they could not see more than 100 yards or so round the vessel. No change took place until night, and then Edmund, who had been too excited and anxious to sleep on the previous night, lay down to rest, ordering that he should be woke if any change took place in the weather. As the sun rose next morning the fog gradually lifted, and they were able to see where they were. Their head pointed west. Far away on their left could be seen a low line of coast. Not a sail was in sight, and indeed sails would have been useless, for the water was still unruffled by a breath of wind. The anchors were at once got up and the oars manned, and the ship's head turned toward the shore. 2 hours' rowing took them within a short distance of land, and keeping about a mile out they rowed to the west. The men, knowing how anxious was their leader to overtake the Danish galleys, rowed their hardest, relieving each other by turns, so that half the oars were constantly going. Without intermission they rowed until night set in, and then cast anchor. When the wind came, it was not until the 3rd day. It was ahead, and instead of helping the Dragon it greatly impeded its progress. So far they had seen nothing of the galleys, and had the mortification of knowing that in spite of all their efforts these were probably gaining ground upon them every day. Even without wind the galleys would row faster than the Dragon, and being so fully manned would be able to keep all their oars going, but against the wind their advantage would be increased greatly, for lying low in the water they would offer but little resistance to it, and would be able to make way at a brisk pace, while the Dragon could scarcely move against it. The Saxon ship was off Calais when the breeze sprang up, and as it increased and their progress became slower and slower, Edmund held a consultation with his companions, and was determined to run across the channel and lie in the mouth of the Thames till the wind turned. So long as it continued to blow they would lag farther and farther behind the chase, who might, moreover, enter any of the rivers in search of shelter or provisions, and so escape their pursuers altogether. Siegbert had never been up the Mediterranean, but he had talked with many Danes who had been. These had told him that the best course was to sail west to the extremity of England, then to steer due south until they came upon the north coast of Spain. They would follow this to its western extremity, then run south following the land till they came to a channel some 10 miles wide, which formed the entrance of the Mediterranean. They decided therefore to follow this course in hopes of interrupting the galleys there. They would thus avoid the dangerous navigation of the west coast of France, where they were known to be many islands and rocks, and around which the tides ran with great fury. For a fortnight the Dragon lay windbound, then came 2 days of calm, and then, to their delight, the pennon on the top of the mast blew out from the east. They were lying in the mouth of the Colne, and would therefore have no difficulty in making the foreland, and with her sails set and her oars out, the Dragon dashed away from her moorings. Swiftly they ran round the south-easterly point of England, and then flew before the breeze along the southern coast. On the 3rd day they were off Land's End, and hauled her head to the south. The east wind held. The Bay of Biscay was calm, and after a rapid voyage they sighted the high lands of Spain ahead. Then they sheered to the west till they rounded its extremity, and then sailed down the coast of Spain. They put into a river for provisions, and the natives assembled in great numbers on the banks, with the evident intention of opposing a landing. But upon Egbert shouting that they were not Danes but Saxons, and were ready to barter for the provisions they required, the natives allowed them to approach. There was no wrangling for terms. Cattle were purchased, the water tanks filled up, and a few hours after entering the river the Dragon was again under way. Rounding the southern point they followed the land. After a day's sailing they perceived land on their right, and gave a shout of joy at the thought that they had arrived at the entrance of the straits. At nightfall they dropped anchor. "What are you looking at, Siegbert?" Edmund asked, seeing the Jarl looking thoughtfully at the anchor chain as the ship swung round. "I am thinking," the Jarl said, "that we must have made some error. Do you not see that she rides just as we were sailing, with her head to the northeast? That shows that the current is against us." "Assuredly it does, but the current's a very slack one, for the ropes are not tight." "But that agrees not," Siegbert said, "with what I have been told. In the first place, this channel points to the northeast, whereas I have heard the straits into the Mediterranean run due east. In the next place, those who have been through have told me that there are no tides as in the northern seas, but that the current runs ever, like a river, to the east." "If that be so," Edmund said, "we must have mistaken our way, for here what current there is runs to the west. Tomorrow morning, instead of proceeding farther, we will cross to the opposite side, and will follow that down until we strike upon the right channel." In the morning sail was again made, and crossing what was really the Bay of Cadiz, they sailed on till they arrived at the mouth of the straits. There was no doubt now that they were right. The width of the channel, its direction, and the steady current through it, all corresponded with what Siegbert had heard, and proceeding a mile along they cast anchor. They soon opened communications with the natives, who, although speaking a tongue unknown to them, soon comprehended by their gestures and the holding up of articles of barter that their intentions were friendly. Trade was established, and there was now nothing to do but to await the coming of the galleys. "I would," Edmund said, as when evening was closing he looked across the straits at the low hills on the opposite side, "that this passage was narrower. Sweyn will doubtless have men on board his ship who have sailed in these seas before, and will not need to grope his way along as we have done. If he enters the straits at night we shall see nothing of him, and the current runs so fast that he would sweep speedily by. It is possible, indeed, that he has already passed. If he continued to row down the shores of France all the time we were lying windbound, he would have had so long a start when the east wind began to blow that, although the galleys carry but little sail, they might well have been here some days before us. Sweyn would be anxious to join Hastings as soon as he could. The men would be thirsting for booty, and would make but short halt anywhere. I will stay but a week. If in that time they come not, we will enter this southern sea and seek the fleet of Hastings. When we find that, we shall find Sweyn. But I fear that the search will be a long one, for these people speak not our tongue, and we shall have hard work in gaining tidings of the whereabouts of the Northmen's fleet." Day and night a vigilant watch was kept up from the masthead of the Dragon, but without success. Each day they became more and more convinced that Sweyn must be ahead of them, and on the morning of the seventh day they lifted their anchor and proceeded through the straits. Many had been the consultations between Edmund and his friends, and it had been determined at last to sail direct for Rome. Siegbert knew that by sailing somewhat to the north of east, after issuing from the passage, they would in time arrive at Italy. At Rome there was a monastery of Saxon monks, and through them they would be able to obtain full information as to the doings and whereabouts of the squadron of Hastings. Scarcely were they through the straits than the wind, veering to the southeast, prevented them from making the course they had fixed on, but they were able to coast along by the shore of Spain. They put into several small ports as they cruised up, but could obtain no intelligence of the Danes, being unable to converse except by signs. When they reached Marseilles they were pleased to meet with Franks, with whom they could converse, and hire a pilot acquainted with the coasts of the Mediterranean. They learned that Hastings and his fleet had harried the coasts of Provence and Italy, that the Genoese galleys had had several engagements with them, but had been worsted. The Danish fleet was now off the coast of Sicily, and the Northmen were ravaging that rich and fertile island. They were reported to have even threatened to ascend the Tiber and to burn Rome. Having obtained the services of a man who spoke both the Italian and Frankish tongues, Edmund started again. He first went to Genoa, as he thought that the people there might be despatching another fleet against the Northmen, in which case he would have joined himself to them, but on his arrival there he was well entertained by the Genoese when they learned through the interpreter who they were, and that they had come from England as enemies of the Danes. Edmund and his Saxons were much surprised at the splendour of Genoa, which immensely surpassed anything they had hitherto seen in the magnificence of its buildings, the dress and appearance of its inhabitants, the variety of the goods displayed by the traders, and the wealth and luxury which distinguished it. It was indeed their first sight of civilization, and Edmund felt how vastly behind was northern Europe, and understood for the first time Alfred's extreme eagerness to raise the condition of his people. On the other hand, the Genoese were surprised at the dress and appearance of the Saxons. The crew of the Dragon were picked men, and their strength and stature, the width of their soldiers and the muscles of their arms, and, above all, their fair hair and blue eyes, greatly astonished the Genoese. Edmund and his companions might have remained in Genoa and received entertainment and hospitality from its people for a long time, but after a stay of a day or two, having obtained the various stores necessary for their voyage, Edmund determined to proceed. 3 of the young Genoese nobles, fired by the story which they heard of the adventures which the Dragon had gone through, and desirous of taking part in any action which she might fight against the Danes, begged leave to accompany them. Edmund gladly acceded to the request, as their presence would be of great utility in other ports at which the Dragon might touch. At Genoa, Edmund procured garments for his men similar to those worn by the Italian soldiers and sailors, and here he sold to the gold and silver smiths a large number of articles of value which they had captured from the Danes, or with which the Count Eudes and his people of Paris had presented them. The Dragon differed but little in appearance from the galleys of the Genoese, and Edmund determined, when he approached the shores when the Northmen were plundering, to pass as a Genoese ship, for should the news come to Sweyn's eyes that a Saxon galley was in the Mediterranean, it might put him on his guard, as he would believe that she was specially in pursuit of his own vessel. On arriving at the mouth of the Tiber, the Dragon ascended the river and anchored under the walls of the imperial city. The Genoese nobles had many friends and relations there, and Edmund, Egbert, and Siegbert were at once installed as guests in a stately palace. The Pope, upon hearing that the strange galley which had anchored in the river was a Saxon, sent an invitation to its commander to visit him, and Edmund and his kinsmen were taken by their Italian friends to his presence. The Pope received them most graciously, and after inquiring after King Alfred and the state of things in England, asked how it was that a Saxon ship has made so long a voyage. Edmund explained that he was in search of a Danish damsel, who had once shown him great kindness, and who had been carried off from her father by one of the Vikings of Hastings' fleet. When he said that they had taken part in the defence of Paris, the Holy Father told him that he now recognized his name, for that a full account of the siege had been sent to him by one of the monks there, and that he had spoken much of the valour of a Saxon captain and the crew of his galley, to whom indeed their successful resistance to the Northmen was in no slight degree due. "Would I could aid you, my son, in your enterprise against these northern pirates. The depredations which they are committing on the shores of Italy are terrible indeed, and we are powerless to resist them. They have even threatened to ascend the Tiber and attack Rome, and though I trust that we might resist their attacks, yet rather than such misfortune as a siege should fall upon my people, I have paid a large sum of money to the leader of the Northmen to abstain from coming hither. But I know that the greed of these pirates does but increase with their gains, and that ere long we may see their pagan banner floated before our walls. A few galleys I could man and place under your orders, but in truth the people of this town are not skilled in naval fighting. I have already endeavoured to unite the states of Genoa, Pisa, and Venice against them, for it is only by common effort that we can hope to overwhelm these wolves of the sea." Edmund expressed his thanks to the Pope for his offer, but said that he would rather proceed with the Dragon alone. "She is to the full as swift as the Northmen's vessels," he said, "and although I would right gladly join any great fleet which might be assembled for an attack upon them, I would rather proceed alone than with a few other ships. Not being strong enough to attack their whole armament, I must depend upon stratagem to capture the galley of which I am specially in pursuit, and will, with your permission, set out as soon as I have transformed my ship so that she will pass muster as a galley of Genoa or Venice." The Holy Father gave orders that every assistance should be afforded to Edmund to carry out his designs, and the next morning a large number of artisans and workmen took possession of the Dragon. She was painted from stem to stern with bright colours. Carved woodwork was added to her forecastle and poop, and a great deal of gilding overlaid upon her. The shape of her bow was altered, and so transformed was she that none would have known her for the vessel which had entered the Tiber, and she would have passed without observation as a galley of Genoa. A number of prisoners accustomed to row in the state galleys were placed on board to work the oars, thus leaving the whole of the crew available for fighting purposes, and a state officer was put in command of these galley slaves. The ship was well stored with provisions, and after a farewell interview with the Pope, Edmund and his companions returned on board ship, and the Dragon took her way down the river. The fleet of the Northmen was at Palermo, and keeping under the land, the Saxon ship sailed down the coast to Calabria, and at night crossed near the mouth of the straits to the shore of Sicily. They entered a quiet bay, and Edmund, dressed as a Dane, with the 2 Northmen who had accompanied him from Paris, landed and journeyed on foot to Palermo. Everywhere they came upon scenes similar to those with which they were familiar in France. Villages burned and destroyed, houses deserted, orchards and crops wasted, and a country destitute of inhabitants, all having fled to the mountains to escape the invader. They did not meet with a single person upon their journey. When they approached Palermo they waited until nightfall, and then boldly entered the town. Here the most intense state of misery prevailed. Many of the inhabitants had fled before the arrival of the Danes, but those who remained were kept in a state of cruel subjection by their conquerors, who brutally oppressed and ill-used them, making free with all their possessions and treating them as slaves. The Danes entered into conversation with some of their countrymen, and, professing to have that evening but newly arrived from home, learned much of the disposition of the fleet of the Northmen. They pretended that they were desirous of joining the galleys under the command of Sweyn, and were told that these had arrived 3 weeks before, and were now absent, with some others, on the southern side of the island. Having obtained this information, Edmund and his companions started without delay to rejoin the Dragon. Upon reaching her she at once put to sea. Palermo was passed in the night, and the vessel held her way down the western coast of Sicily. She was now under sail alone, and each night lay up at anchor in order that she might not pass the Danish galleys unobserved. On the 3rd day after passing Palermo, several galleys were seen riding off a small port. The wind was very light, and after a consultation with his friends, Edmund determined to simulate flight, so as to tempt the Danes to pursue, for with so light a breeze their smaller galleys would row faster than the Dragon. Besides, it was possible that Sweyn might be on shore. It was early morning when the Danish galleys were seen, and apparently the crews were still asleep, for no movement on board was visible, and the Dragon sailed back round a projecting point of land and then cast anchor. It was so important to learn whether Sweyn was with Freda on board his ship, or whether, as was likely, he had established himself on shore, that it was decided it would be better to send the 2 Danes to reconnoitre before determining what plan should be adopted. Chapter 18. Freda discovered. The spies upon their return reported that Sweyn had taken up his abode in the mansion of the Count of Ugoli, who was the lord of that part of the country. Most of the Danes lived on shore in the houses of townspeople. Many of these had been slain, and the rest were treated as slaves. The Lady Freda was also on shore, and it was thought that she would ere long become the bride of the Viking. "Think you that there will be any possibility of surprising the house and carrying her off?" "I think not," the Dane said, "for Sweyn's men are on the alert and keep good guard. For the people of this part of the island, being maddened by their exactions and cruelty, have banded themselves together, and although they cannot understand the strong parties which go out in search of plunder, they cut off stragglers, and have made several attacks on small parties. It is thought that they may even venture an attack upon the place at night. Therefore sentries are set, and a portion of the force remains always under arms, in readiness to sally out in case of alarm." "I would fain go myself," Edmund said, "and see how matters stand, and try to communicate with Freda. It may be that her long resistance has tired her out, and that she is the point of consenting to become Sweyn's bride." "I think not that," Siegbert replied. "When Freda has once made up her mind she is not given to change." "Oh, I doubt not her resolution," Edmund said, "but none can blame her if, after all these months, she has begun to despair of rescue. Nay, it is even probable that, having Sweyn, who is assuredly a brave and enterprising Viking, always near her, she may have come to love him." "No, Edmund," Siegbert replied, "I am sure you need have no fear that she has softened towards Sweyn. But how do you think of proceeding if you land?" "I will take with me this Dane, and if one of the Genoese nobles will go with me I will take him, and also the man we brought from Marseilles, who acts as an interpreter between us and the Italians." "But why hamper yourself with 2 men who would be even more likely to be detected by the Danes than would you yourself?" "Oh, I shall leave them in the outskirts of the place," Edmund replied. "I would fain see if I can enter into any negotiations with the natives. Perhaps we may arrange that they shall attack the place on the land side, while the Dragon falls upon the galleys, and in any case we may need an interpreter with the people." One of the young Genoese, upon being asked whether he would take part in the adventure, at once consented, and the 4 men, attiring themselves as Danes, speedily landed in the Dragon's boat. The bay in which the ship was lying was some 10 miles along the shore from the town. The spies had made their way along the seacoast by night, but as it was morning when Edmund landed, he thought that it would be safer to make a detour, so as to arrive near the landward side of the town, and so enter it after dark. They had not proceeded far when they came upon the ruins of a village. It had been destroyed by fire, and the freshness of the charred beams showed that it had been done but a short time before, probably not many days. Marks of blood could be seen in the roadway, but no bodies were visible, and Edmund supposed that, after the Danes had retired, the survivors must have returned and buried their dead. They had not proceeded far when the Dane pointed out to Edmund a half-naked lad who was running with the swiftness of a deer over a slope of some little distance. "He is going too fast for us to catch him," Edmund said carelessly, "and as even if we did so he could give us no information of any use, for you may be sure he has not ventured near the town, we may well let him go on his way." For 3 or 4 miles further they pursued their course. The country, which was exceedingly fertile and covered with cornfields and vineyards, appeared entirely deserted. Here and there a wide blackened track showed where, from carelessness or malice, a brand had been thrown into the standing corn. "The Danes are ever the same," Edmund said. "Well, may they be called the sea wolves. It would be bad enough did they only plunder and kill those who oppose them, but they destroy from the pure love of destroying, and slay for the pleasure of slaying. Why are these robbers permitted to be the scourge of Europe?" "Why, indeed," the Genoese repeated when the interpreter had translated Edmund's exclamation to him. "'Tis shame and disgrace that Christendom does not unite against them. They are no more invincible now than they were when Caesar overran their country and brought them into subjugation. What the Romans could do then would be easy for the Christian powers to do now, if they would but make common cause against these marauders. Nay, Italy alone should be able, at any rate, to sweep the Mediterranean free of their pirate galleys. But Venice and Genoa and Pisa are consumed by their own petty jealousies and quarrels, while all our sea coasts are ravaged by these wolves of the ocean. Ah, what is that?" he exclaimed, breaking off, as an arrow struck smartly against his helmet. They were at the moment passing through a small wood which bordered the road on both sides. The first arrow seemed but a signal, for in an instant a score of others flew among the party. It was well that they carried with them the long Danish shields which nearly covered their whole body. As it was, several slight wounds were inflicted, and the interpreter fell dead with an arrow in his forehead. Immediately following the flight of arrows, a crowd of peasants armed with staves, axes, and pikes dashed out from the wood on both sides and fell upon them, uttering shouts of "Death to the marauders! Kill the sea wolves!" So great was the din that, although the Genoese shouted loudly that they were not Danes but friends, his words were unheard in the din, and attacked fiercely on all sides, the 3 men were forced to defend themselves for their lives. Standing back to back in the form of a triangle, they defended themselves valiantly against the desperate attacks of their assailants. Several of these were cut down, but so furious was the attack of the maddened peasants that the defenders were borne down by the weight of numbers, and one by one beaten to the ground. Then the peasants rained blows upon them as if they had been obnoxious wild beasts, and in spite of their armour would speedily have slain them, had not the Genoese with a great effort pulled from his breast a cross, which was suspended there by a silken cord, and held it up, shouting, "We are Christians, we are Italians, we are no Danes." So surprised were the peasants at the sight that they recoiled from their victims. The Dane was already insensible. Edmund had just strength to draw his dagger and hold up the cross hilt and repeat the words, "We are Christians." It was the sight of the cross rather than the words which had arrested the attacks of the peasants. Indeed, the words of the Genoese were scarcely understood by them, so widely did their own patois differ from the language of polished Italy. The fact, however, that these Danes were Christians seemed so extraordinary to them that they desisted from their attack. The Danes, they knew, were pagans and bitterly hostile to Christianity, the monasteries and priests being special objects of their hostility. The suggestion of one of the peasants that the cross had no doubt been taken from the body of some man murdered by the Danes revived the passion of the rest, and nearly cost the prisoners their lives. But an older man, who seemed to have a certain authority over the others, said that the matter must be inquired into, especially as the man who had the cross, and who continued to address them in Italian, clearly spoke some language approaching their own. He would have questioned them further, but the Genoese was now rapidly losing consciousness from the pain of his wounds and the loss of blood. The 3 prisoners were therefore bound, and being placed on rough litters constructed of boughs, were carried off by the peasants. The strength and excellence of Edmund's armour had enabled him to withstand the blows better than his companions, and he retained his consciousness of what was passing. For 3 hours their journey continued. At the end of that time they entered a wood high up on the hillside. There was a great clamour of voices round, and he judged that his conductors had met another party, and that they were at the end of their journey. The litters were now laid down, and Edmund struggled to his feet. Before him stood a tall and handsome man in the attire of a person of the upper class. The old peasant was explaining to him the manner of their capture of the prisoners, and the reason why they had spared their lives. "How is it," the noble asked when he had finished, turning to Edmund, "that you who are Danes and pagans, plunderers and murderers, claim to be Christians?" Edmund did not understand the entire address, but he had already picked up a little Italian, which was not difficult for him from his acquaintance with French. "We are not Danes," he said. "We are their enemies. I am a Saxon earl, and this, my friend, is a noble of Genoa." "A Saxon!" the Italian exclaimed in surprise. "One of the people of King Alfred, and this a Genoese noble? How is it that you are masquerading here as Danes?" "I speak but a few words of Italian," Edmund said, "but my friend will tell you the whole story when he recovers. I pray you to order aid to be given to him at once," although still at a loss to understand how it had come about. The Count of Ugoli, for it was that noble himself, saw that his prisoner's statement must be a true one. In their native patois he hastily told the peasants that there must be some mistake, and that although their prisoners seemed to be Danes, they were really Christians and friends. He bade them instantly to strip off their armour, to bind up their wounds, and to use all their efforts to restore them to life. At his bidding one of the peasants brought a wine-skin, and filling a large cup with the liquid offered it to Edmund. The latter drained it at a draught, for he was devoured by a terrible thirst. After this he felt revived, and soon had the satisfaction of seeing his comrades recovering under the ministrations of the peasants, who chafed their hands, applied cool poultices of bruised leaves to their bruises, and poured wine down their throats. In half an hour the Genoese was sufficiently recovered to be able to sit up and to give a full account of their presence here, and of their object in assuming the disguise of Danes. He then told the Count that Edmund had intended to reconnoitre the place alone, and that he hoped he and his people would attack the town while the Saxons in their galley made an assault from the sea. The Count replied that the peasantry could not be induced to take such a step. "I will, however, aid your friend," he said, "by a feigned attack tomorrow evening when he is there. This may help him to escape, and if the Danes sally out next day in pursuit, there will be the fewer for them to cope with." When Edmund awoke the next morning he found himself able to walk and move without difficulty, and with but little pain, thanks to the care of the peasants, and in the afternoon, being furnished by the Count with a guide, he started for the town. When he arrived within a short distance he dismissed his guide, and lay down in some bushes till nightfall, when he rose and made his way into the town, passing unobserved between the watchfires made by the parties of Danes encamped in its outskirts to protect it against surprise. Once in the town he walked boldly on, having no fear of recognition or question. Sounds of carousing came through the open casements, but few people were in its streets. He made his way down to the seashore, which he followed until he came to a large and stately mansion standing in beautifully laid out gardens at the end of the town. Several tents were erected in the garden, and although the night was not cold, great fires had been lighted, around which the Danes were carousing. Avoiding these, Edmund walked up to the open windows. The first room he looked into was deserted, but in the next, which was a large apartment, a number of Danes were seated at table. At its head sat Svea, with Freda on his right hand. Around were a number of his leading men, the captains of the galleys and their wives. The meal was over and the wine cup was passing round. A number of attendants moved about the room, and many of the warriors who had supped elsewhere stood round the table, joining in the conversation and taking their share of the wine. Edmund saw at once that he could not hope for a more favourable opportunity, and he accordingly entered the mansion, and, passing through the open door, joined the party within, keeping himself in the rear of those standing round the table, so that the light from the lamps placed there should not fall upon his face. Just as he had taken his place, Sven called out, "Let us have a song. Odoker, the minstrel, do you sing to us the song of the Raven?" A minstrel bearing a small harp advanced into the centre of the horseshoe table, and after striking a chord began to sing, or rather to chant, one of the favourite songs of the sea rovers. A shout of applause rose from the Danes as the minstrel ceased, and holding their goblets high above their heads they drank to the Raven. While the singing was going on, Edmund quietly made his way round to one of the open windows. It was the hour at which the count had promised to make his attack, and he listened eagerly for any sound which might tell that the peasants had begun their work. Other songs followed the first, and Edmund began to be afraid that the courage of the peasants had failed at the last moment. Suddenly he saw lights appear at 5 or 6 points in the distance, and putting his head out he thought he could hear distant cries and shouts. The lights grew brighter, and soon broad tongues of flame shot up. Shouts at once arose from the guards without. Some of the revellers, hearing these, went to the windows to see what was happening, and gave a cry of alarm. "Sweyn, we must be attacked. Fires are rising in the outskirts of the town." "These cowards would never venture to disturb us," Sweyn said scornfully. "Of all the foes we have ever met, none were so feeble and timid as these Italians." But see, Sweyn, the flames are rising from 8 points. This can't be an accident." Sweyn rose from his seat and went to the window. "No, by Woden," he exclaimed, "there is mischief here. Let us arm ourselves, and do you," he said, turning to a young man, "run swiftly to the outposts and learn what is the meaning of this." Scarcely, however, had he spoken than a man ran breathlessly into the hall. "Haste to the front, Jarl," he said to Sweyn. "We are attacked. Some of the enemy, creeping in between our fires, set fire to the houses in the outskirts, and so we leapt to our feet in astonishment at the sudden outbreak. They fell upon us. Many of my comrades were killed with the first discharge of arrows. Then they rushed on in such numbers that many more were slain and the rest driven in. How it fares with the other posts I know not, but methinks they were all attacked at the same moment. I waited not to see, for my captain bade me speed here with the news." "Sound the horn of assembly," Sweyn said. "Do you, Oderic, take 20 of the guard without, and at once conduct the ladies here to the boats and get them on board the galleys. Let all others hasten to the scene of attack. But I can hardly even now believe that this coward herd intend to attack us in earnest." In the confusion which reigned as the warriors were seizing their shields and arms, Edmund approached Freda, who had with the rest risen from her seat. "The Dragon is at hand," he whispered. "In a few hours we will attack Sweyn's galley. Barricade yourself in your cabin until the fight is over." Freda gave a little start as Edmund's first words reached her ear. Then she stood still and silent. She felt her hand taken and pressed, and glanced round, met Edmund's eyes for a moment, just as he turned and joined the Danes who were leaving the hall. A minute later Oderic entered with the guard, and at once escorted the women down to the boats, and rowed them off to the galleys. Meanwhile Sweyn and the main body of the Danes rushed impetuously to the outskirts of the town. The fighting was already at an end, the peasants having withdrawn after their first success. 2 or 3 of the parties round the watchfires had been annihilated before they could offer any effectual resistance. Others had beaten off the attack, and had fallen back in good order to the houses, losing, however, many men on the way from the arrows which their assailants shot among them. Sweyn and the Norsemen were furious at the loss they had suffered, but as pursuit would have been useless, there was nothing to be done for the present, and after posting strong guards in case the attack should be renewed, the Danish leaders returned to the banqueting hall, where, over renewed draughts of wine, a council was held. Most of these present were in favour of sending out a strong expedition on the following day to avenge the attack, but Sweyn argued that it might be that the natives had assembled from all parts of the island, and that this sudden attack, the like of which had not been attempted before, was perhaps made only to draw them out into an ambush, or to attack the town in their absence. Therefore he urged it was better to delay making an expedition for a short time, when they would find the enemy unprepared. After some discussion, Sweyn's arguments were prevailing, and it was determined to postpone the expedition for a few days. Chapter 19. United. No sooner did Edmund find himself outside the mansion than he separated himself from the Danes, and, following the seashore, set out on his return to the Dragon. The tide was out, and although the night was dark, he had no difficulty in finding his way along the shore, keeping close to the margin of the waves. When he approached the headland he was forced to take to the land, as the waves beat against the foot of the rock. Guided by the stars he made his way across the cape and came down on to the shore of the bay. A light was burning on the poop of the Dragon, and his hail was at once answered. A few minutes later a boat touched the shore beside him, and he was soon on board the ship, and at once held council with Egbert and Siegbert, to whom he related all that had happened. He learned from them that his 2 wounded comrades had been brought down to the beach that evening by the country people, and had told them how narrow an escape they had had of death at the hands of the enraged peasants. After a discussion of all the different plans upon which they might act, it was determined that the attempt to rescue Freda should be made at once, as they considered it certain that Sweyn, with a large portion of his band, would set out at daybreak to take vengeance upon the natives. The plan decided upon was that they should proceed along the shore, and that if the Danish galleys, being undermanned, did not put out in pursuit, they should sail in and attack them. The Danes were indeed greatly superior in force, for they had counted the ships, the smallest of which would carry 100 men. Still, in the absence of a portion of their crews, and from the effects of surprise, they thought that success was possible. The next morning sail was hoisted, and the Dragon made her way along the coast. The hour was later than that at which she had shown herself on the previous day. She sailed on until within 2 miles of the town, and then suddenly turned her head seaward, as if she had only then perceived the Danish vessels. The instant she did so a great bustle was observed among them. Many boats were seen pushing off from shore crowded with men, oars were got out and sails loosed. "From the number of men who are crowding on board," Egbert said, "I believe that Sweyn cannot have started in pursuit of the natives. In that case we shall have a hard fight of it." "So much the better," Siegbert exclaimed. "I should consider our task was half accomplished if we rescued Freda without punishing Sweyn. Let them come," he said, shaking his battle axe at the galleys. "Though my leg is stiff, my arms are not, as Sweyn shall learn if I meet him." The Dragon's oars were now put out, and the galley slaves began to row, the Saxons concealing themselves behind the bulwarks. In a few minutes the whole of the Danish galleys were unmoored and started in the pursuit of the supposed Italian vessel. The breeze was light, but somewhat helped the Dragon. 4 of the Northman vessels were large ships with sails, and these speedily fell behind, but the others with their oars gained slowly on the Dragon. Edmund saw with satisfaction that the 2 galleys of Sweyn, which he had once recognized, were somewhat faster than their consorts, and the slaves were made to row as hard as they could, in order to prolong the chase as much as possible, by which means Sweyn's galleys would be the further separated from the others. After the pursuit had been continued for some miles, Sweyn's galleys were but a few hundred yards in the rear, and were nearly a quarter of a mile ahead of those of their comrades, which had gained but little upon the Dragon since the chase began. Edmund ordered the men to cease rowing as if despairing of escape. The Genoese took their station on the poop, and as Sweyn's galley came rushing up they shouted to it that they would surrender if promised their lives. The Northmen answered with a shout of triumph and derision, and dashed alongside. Sweyn's own galley was slightly in advance of the others. Edmund ordered the oars to be pulled in as the Northmen came up, so as to allow them to come alongside. Not a word was spoken on board the Dragon till the Danes, leaving their oars, swarmed up the side, headed by Sweyn himself. Then Edmund gave a shout, the Saxons leaped to their feet, and raising their battle cry fell upon the astonished Danes. Those who had climbed up were instantly cut down or hurled back into their own galley, and the Saxons leaping down, a tremendous fight ensued. Edmund with Siegbert and half his crew boarded the Dane close to the poop, and so cut the Northmen off from that part of the vessel, while Egbert with the rest boarded farther forward. The Danes would have been speedily overpowered had not the second galley arrived upon the spot, and these, seeing the combat which was raging, at once leaped upon Sweyn's galley. With this accession of force, although numbers of the Danes had fallen in the first attack, they still outnumbered the Saxons. Sweyn, heading his men, made a desperate effort to drive back Edmund's party. His men, however, fought less bravely than usual. Their astonishment at finding the ship which they had regarded as an easy prize, instead manned by Saxons, was overwhelming, and the sight of Siegbert, whom many of them knew, in the front rank of their enemies, added to their confusion. Sweyn himself, as he recognized Edmund, at once made at him, and, wielding a heavy axe in his left hand, strove to cut him down, and Edmund, strong and skillful as he was, had great difficulty in parrying the blows which the Northmen rained upon him. The combat, however, was decided by Siegbert, who hurled his javelin at Sweyn, the weapon passing completely through Sweyn's body. Sweyn fell on the deck with a crash. The Northmen, dispirited at the fall of their leader, hesitated, and as the Saxons sprang upon them, turned and fled into the other galley. The door of the poop opened, and Freda flew into her father's arms. "Quick, Siegbert, to the Dragon!" Edmund cried, and shouted orders to his men. "There is not a moment to be lost. The other galleys are just upon us." The Saxons rushed back to the Dragon. The oars were thrust out again, and the vessel got under way just as the other Danish galleys arrived on the spot. While some of the Saxons poured volleys of arrows and javelins into the Northmen, the others, at Edmund's order, leaped down and double banked the oars. The increase of power was soon manifest, and the Dragon began to draw away from the Danes. Gradually their galleys fell back out of bowshot, and after continuing the chase for some little time longer, they abandoned it as hopeless, and lay upon their oars to rest. A shout of triumph rose from the Saxons, and then Edmund, who had hitherto been fully occupied with the command of the vessel, turned to Freda, who was still standing by her father. "I have been a long time in fulfilling my promise, Freda," he said, "but, as your father will tell you, I have done my best. Thank God, who has given me success at last." "I never doubted that you would come, Edmund," she said, "and the knowledge has enabled me to stand firm against both the entreaties and threats of Sweyn. How can I thank you for all you have done for me?" "I have spoken to your father, Freda, and he has promised me your hand, if you indeed are willing to bestow it. I promised to come for you if you would wait, nearly 5 years ago, and I have never thought of any other woman." "I have waited for you, Edmund," she said simply, "and would never have wed another had you not come. You are my hero, and methinks I have loved you ever since the day when you boarded our ship off the mouth of the Humber." "Take her, Edmund," Siegbert said. "You have nobly won her, and there is no one to whom I could be so well content to entrust her. And now join your hands in token of betrothal." The crew of the Dragon, who had been watching the scene, raised a shout of gladness as they saw Siegbert place Freda's hand in that of Edmund. They had guessed that their lord must have an affection for this Danish maiden in whose pursuit they had come so far, and were delighted at the happy issue of the expedition. "I trust, Freda," Edmund said to her after a while, "that you have thought of the talk we had about religion, and that you will forsake the barbarous gods of your people and become a Christian, as so many of your people have done in England, and that you will be wedded to me not in the rude way of the Danes, but in a Christian church." "I have thought much of it," she said, "and have come to think that your God of peace must be better than the gods of war, but I would fain know more of him before I desert the religion of my fathers." "That shall you," Edmund said. "With your father's permission I will place you for a short time in a convent in Rome, and one of the Saxon monks shall teach you the tenets of our faith. It will be but for a short time, dear, and while you are there we will try and capture some of Hastings' galleys filled with plunder, for my men have come far, and I would fain that they returned with an ample booty." Freda and Siegbert agreed to the plan, and the latter said, "I too will tarry in Rome while you are away, Edmund. I could fight against Sweyn, for it was in a private quarrel, but I cannot war against my countrymen. I too will talk with your Saxon monks and hear about this new religion of yours, for I think that as I have no others to love or care for, I shall return to England with you, and if you will have me, take up my abode in your English home, so as to be near you and my daughter." The Dragon returned to Rome. There Edmund procured lodgings for Siegbert and Freda, and the Saxon monks gladly arranged to visit them and instruct them in the doctrines of Christianity. The Dragon sailed again for the coast of Sicily, and was absent a month, during which time she captured a number of Danish galleys, most of which were laden with rich booty. Then she returned to Rome. A few days later a solemn service was held, at which Freda and Siegbert were baptized as Christians, and after this was done a marriage service, and Edmund and Freda married with the rites of the Christian Church. The Pope himself was present at the services, and bestowed his blessing upon the newly married couple, the novelty of the occasion drawing a vast crowd of spectators. A few days later the Dragon again put to sea, and after a speedy voyage with favourable weather arrived in England without further adventure. Edmund's arrival at home was the occasion of great rejoicings. The news of the share which the Dragon and her crew had taken in the defence of Paris had reached England, but none knew what had become of her from that time, and when months had passed without tidings of her being received, it was generally supposed that she must have been lost. Her return, laden with rich booty, excited the greatest enthusiasm, and the king himself journeyed to Sherborne to welcome Edmund on his arrival there. "So this is the reason," he said smiling, when Edmund presented Freda to him, "why you were ever so insensible to the attractions of our Saxon maidens. Truly the reason is a fair one, and fully excuses you, and right glad am I to welcome your bonny bride to our shores." Alfred remained 3 days at Sherborne, and then left Edmund to administer the affairs of his earldom, for which a substitute had been provided in his absence. The large plunder which the Dragon had brought home had enriched all who had sailed in her, and greatly added to the prosperity which prevailed in Edmund's district. He found that in his absence Alfred had introduced many changes. The administration of justice was no longer in the hands of the ealdormen, judges having been appointed who journeyed through the land and administered justice. Edmund highly approved of the change, for though in most cases the ealdormen had acted to the best of their powers, they had a great deal of other business to do. Besides, their decisions necessarily aggrieved one party or the other, and sometimes caused feuds and bad feelings, and were always liable to be suspected of being tinged with partiality, whereas the judges, being strangers in the district, would give their decisions without bias or favour. Freda had, as was the custom, taken a new name in baptism, but at Edmund's request her name had only been changed to the Christian one of Elfrida, and Edmund to the end of his life continued to call her by her old name. She speedily became as popular in the earldom as was her husband. Siegbert, who had been christened Harold, took kindly to his new life. Between him and Egbert a great friendship had sprung up, and Edmund built for their joint use a house close to his own. In 884 Alfred heard that the Danes of East Anglia were in correspondence with their countrymen at home and in France, and that there was danger that the peace of England would be disturbed. The thanes were therefore bidden to prepare for another struggle, to gather sufficient arms in readiness for all the able-bodied men in their district, and to call out their contingents from time to time to practice in the use of arms. The ealdormen whose seats of government bordered on the sea were ordered to construct ships of war, so that any Danish armament might be met at sea. Edmund was appointed to command this fleet, and was instructed to visit the various ports to superintend the construction of the ships, and when they were completed to exercise their crews in naval manoeuvres. The winter of 884 was spent by Edmund in the performance of these duties. The Dragon was again fitted out, and in her he cruised from port to port. Freda, who was passionately fond of the sea, accompanied him, as did Siegbert and Egbert. It was not until May in 885 that the threatened invasion took place. Then the news came to the king that the Danes had landed in large numbers near Rochester, and had laid siege to the town. The king instantly summoned his fighting array, and in a few days moved at the head of a large army towards Kent. Rochester was defending itself valiantly. The Danes erected a great tower opposite to the principal gate, and, overwhelming the defenders on the walls with their missiles, endeavoured to force their way in by battering down the gate. The inhabitants, however, piled great masses of stone behind it, and even when the gate was battered in, the Danes, with all their efforts, were unable to force an entrance. The Saxon army advanced with such celerity that the Danes had received no news of their coming until they were close at hand. Then one of their foraging parties arrived with the intelligence that a great Saxon army was upon them. The Danes were seized with a sudden panic and fled precipitately to their ships, leaving behind them the horses they had brought from France, their stores, and all the prisoners and spoil they had gathered in their incursions in the neighbourhood of Rochester. Seeing how well the Saxons were prepared for resistance, the greater portion of the Danes crossed to France, but 16 of their vessels entered the Stour and joined their allies of East Anglia. Alfred ordered his fleet to assemble in the Medway, and in a fortnight the vessels from all the southern ports arrived. They were filled with fighting men, and sailed to attack the Danes in the Stour, after which the force was to land and to inflict a severe punishment upon East Anglia. On hearing of the gathering of the Saxon fleet, Athelstan sent across to France and begged the Danes to come to his assistance, but none of their vessels had arrived when the Saxon fleet reached the mouth of the Stour. The fighting force on board the Danish ships had been largely reinforced by their countrymen of East Anglia, and in a close body they rowed out to give battle to the Saxons. A desperate fight ensued, but after a struggle, which continued for many hours, the Danes were completely defeated, the whole of their vessels were captured, and all on board put to the sword. On the following day the army landed and ravaged the surrounding country, and returned to the ships with much booty. As they sailed out of the river they saw a vast fleet of the enemy approaching. Athelstan had assembled his ships from all the ports of East Anglia, and had been joined by a large reinforcement of his countrymen from France. The Saxons were greatly outnumbered, but a portion of the fleet fought with great bravery. Some of the ships, however, being manned with newly collected crews unaccustomed to naval war, lost heart and made but a poor resistance. Alfred was on board the Dragon, which sank several of the Danish galleys, and with some of her consorts continued the fight until nightfall, beating off every attempt of the Danes to board them. Seeing that several of the ships had been captured, that others had taken to flight, and that there was no longer a hope of victory, Alfred gave the signal, and the Dragon and her remaining consorts fought their way through the Danish fleet and made their escape. The valour which the Saxons had shown in these two sea fights, and the strength of the army with which Alfred had so speedily marched to the relief of Rochester, greatly impressed the enemy, and although Rollo came across from Normandy to the assistance of Athelstan, the Danes concluded that it was better to leave the Saxons to themselves. Alfred in the following spring again assembled his army and laid siege to London, which was still in the possession of the Danes. Athelstan did not venture to march to its assistance, and the town, which had long been in the Northmen's hands, was captured. The greater portion of the city was burned in the siege. Alfred ordered it to be rebuilt, inviting its former inhabitants to return, and offered privileges to all who would take up their abode there. The walls were rebuilt and the city placed in a position of defence. Alfred then handed over to Ethelred the ealdorman of Mercia. Peace was now made with Athelstan, and for some years remained unbroken. In 893 a Danish fleet of 250 ships sailed across from Boulogne and landed in the Weald of Kent, which was then covered with a great forest, and there wintered, while the Viking Hasting, with 80 ships, sailed up the Thames and built a strong fort at Milton. Alfred stationed his army in a strong position halfway between the forest and the Danish camp at Milton, so that he could attack either army when they moved out of their stronghold. The Danes for many months remained in the forest, issuing out occasionally to plunder in the open country of Kent, Sussex, and Hampshire, but they met with a stout resistance from the Saxons, who had remained in the towns and in the country as well. After Easter, having collected a considerable amount of spoil, and finding the resistance ever increasing, the Danes moved northward from their forest, intending to march into Essex. The king's forces at once set off to intercept them, and overtook them at Farnham, where the Northmen were completely defeated. All their booty was recaptured, with their horses and stores. Those who escaped fled across the Thames and took refuge on an island in the Colne. The Saxons besieged them there, but when the Danes were about to surrender from want of provisions, the news arrived that the Northmen of Northumbria and East Anglia, with 240 ships, had landed suddenly in Devonshire and had laid siege to Exeter. The siege of the island was at once raised, and King Alfred marched against the new arrivals, and advancing with great speed fell upon them and defeated them. Then hastily returning, he came to London, and, joined by a strong force from Mercia, marched against Milton, where Hasting had been joined by the great number of the Danes who had formed the army in the Weald. Hasting himself was away, but his army marched out to meet the Saxons. A great battle was fought, but the Danes could not resist the ardour of their assailants. Their army was routed and their fortress stormed. All the booty within it fell into the hands of the victors, together with the wives and families of the Danes, among whom were the wife and 2 sons of Hasting. The Danish fleet also was captured, and was burned or taken to London. Another great fleet of the East Angles and Northumbrians sailed up the Thames, and landing, the Northmen marched across to the Severn, but were defeated and destroyed by Ethelred of Mercia. Exeter was again invested by a Danish fleet, and again saved by Alfred. The Danes, as they retired along the south coast, landed near Chichester, where they suffered a heavy defeat from the South Saxons. In the following year a fresh fleet sailed up the Thames, and thence up the Lea, where they constructed a fortress 20 miles above London. Alfred caused 2 fortresses to be erected on the Lea below them, with vast balks of timber entirely obstructing the river. The Danes, finding their retreat cut off, abandoned their ships and marched across England to Quatbridge on the Severn. Their fleet fell into the hands of the Londoners, who burned and broke up all the smaller ships and carried the rest down to London. The Danes were so disconcerted by the many and severe defeats which had befallen them that they now abandoned the idea of again conquering England, and, taking ship, sailed for France. 4 years later, in 901, King Alfred died, having reigned 29 years and 6 months. During his reign England had made immense advances in civilization, and in spite of the devastation wrought by the Danish occupation of Wessex during the early years of his reign, and the efforts required afterward to oppose them, the wealth and prosperity of the country vastly increased during his reign. Abbeys and monasteries had multiplied, public buildings been erected, towns rebuilt and beautified, and learning had made great advances. The laws of the country had been codified and regulated, the administration of justice placed on a firm basis, the kingly authority had greatly increased, and the great ealdormen were no longer semi-independent nobles, but officers of the crown. Serfdom, although not entirely abolished, had been mitigated and regulated. Arts and manufactures had made great progress. Edmund and Freda survived King Alfred many years, and their district continued to be one of the most prosperous and well ruled in the kingdom. Their descendants continued to hold the office of the ealdorman
until the invasion by William the Conqueror, and the holder of the office at that time fell, with numbers of his followers, at the Battle of Hastings. For very many years after that event the prow of the Dragon was kept in the great hall of Sherborne as a memorial of the valiant deeds performed against the Danes by Ealdorman Edmund. End of The Dragon and the Raven, by G. A. Henty. Recording by Mike Harris.